Good evening, good evening, good evening. My name is Derwin Overton. I'm the Executive Director of O.A.R. And I thank each and every one of you for joining me for a discussion, a chat with Dr. Danielle Roods and discussing her book, Surviving Solitary, Living and Working in Restricted Housing Units. Before we get started, I would like to let you know, and you probably already know, we are recording this in the opportunity to be able to use this at a later date and time. We will also have a place where you're able to ask questions during the event and during the discussions. And some of them we will take during and some of them we will take after. Hopefully we're able to get to each and every question, but we do have a limited amount of time. So if we aren't able to get to each and every question, I believe that we will do our best to make sure that we reply to them or get information to you at a later date and time. What I would like to do now is introduce my guest of honor, who I'm so proud to be able to speak to today and this evening. It's author Dr. Danielle Roods, who is a wonderful board member of the organization that I represent, O.A.R, which stands for Opportunities, Alternatives, and Resources, a community nonprofit that provides services for people who've been incarcerated. And we cover Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and Prince William County. And Dr. Roods has been a member of our board for the past 6 years. And we have been very excited to have her as a member of our board. And when this opportunity came up for us to have a discussion, it was a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned because of her partnership, her grace, and her love towards O.A.R. and to me personally as a co-worker and a supporter was a no-brainer and something that I felt like had to be done. Please bear with me for a minute as I read the introduction for Dr. Roods. Dr. Roods is an associate professor of criminology, law, and society, and the deputy director of the Center of Advancing Correctional Excellence at George Mason University. Next fall, and I'm a little disappointed about this, but I'll get over it, she will be moving to Texas to become a professional of criminal justice and criminology at Sam Houston State University. She received her PhD from the University of California, Irvine in 2008. She is an expert qualitative researcher with decades of experience working with correctional agencies, including prisons, jails, probation, parole agencies, and problem-solving courts. As I mentioned earlier, she's also on the executive board at O.A.R, where she serves as the secretary and the chair of the program team. Dr. Roods is recognized for her work examining how social control organizations, management, and street-level workers understand, negotiate, and at times resist change. She's experience includes working with the correction agencies during adoption, adaptation, and implementation of various workplace reforms. As you know, given our talk tonight, she is also the author, as I already mentioned, of Surviving Solitary, Living and Working in Restricted Housing Units with the Stanford University Press. Thank you so much for everything you've done. Let's put this here together. You're greatly appreciated. Dr. Roods has current projects funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse via the Justice Community Opiate Intervention Network and the BJA, Bureau of Justice, as a fellow worker to enhance correctional space and cultures. She's also the associate editor at the Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment and serves on the editorial board of several well-respected academic journals. Dr. Roods has received numerous awards, including research, teaching, and mentoring awards from the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, the Consortium of Undergraduate Law and Justice Programs, and George Mason University. Also in her spare time, which I'm not sure she has a lot of, but seems like she may have a little bit. Well, she's got to have some for these next individuals I'm going to talk about. She's a mother of 3 lively boys, 2 even livelier dogs. She enjoys yoga, gardening, and reading. Please allow me to introduce to you Dr. Danielle Roods, our guest of honor for the night. And thank you for being with us, Danielle.
Thank you.
Well, now that I've gotten through that and had all the time to help people understand exactly who they're listening to and reading your book and so on, I wanted us to have a conversation about your book, some of the important aspects of your books, and help people to understand a little bit more about what motivated you, why you wrote the book, what changes you were hoping to make as far as the book is concerned, and how you can empower people. A lot of your background work was with formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated individuals, and I know there's a connection with that. So we look forward to talking about all of that. And hopefully you guys have read the book like I have and is excited to hear a little bit more in depth about how her mind works and what she was thinking when she wrote it. Danielle, you ready to have a conversation?
I'm ready.
All right, all right. So I think this is this is a beach ball to me, something I'm just lobbing up to you. And let me see where we go with this as far as it's concerned. What motivated or inspired you to do this work, to write a book, to launch a book in this format with O.A.R. nonprofit? Because I haven't seen a lot of formats and things happen in this way. So talk to me a little bit about that if you don't mind.
Okay. What motivated me to write the book? I'll start with that, and then I'll go into my connection with O.A.R. and why that moves me, I think. The book, I don't know. I think the book was destined to be written from when I was a child, and I'll save you the long story. I see a couple of my students are on the phone, and so they're like, Danielle, don't tell that story again. But I think I've just been interested in punishment, the way that we treat other humans, since before I can remember. I'll leave it simply there. But I'm interested in the way that we think about people's wrongs or what we perceive as their wrongs, and then how we, I guess, punish or try to correct those wrongs. And I thought about it as a kid. You know, my mom and I used to go back and forth when she tried to get me to stop using foul language. And I would tell her that the words are symbolic. They don't mean anything except for if you give them meaning. And I would try to argue my way out of crazy punishments that she would dole out to me. And then as a teenager and as a professor, just the work that I did throughout my life always had something to do with carceral spaces. I'm not sure how I kept running into those. I worked as a vocational instructor and a life skills instructor at Goodwill Industries in San Francisco's Mission District before I went back to graduate school. And my students were an amazing array of folks who were struggling. A lot of them had justice involvement or were involved in the criminal legal system in some way. And they were hurting. They were hurting a lot. And it was hard to get them in a place where they believed in themselves again, where they could see something useful for their own daily life. And then in college, I ended up working. I was at the University of California, Irvine, which is an amazing place to study. I worked under the late and amazing Joan Petersilia, and she just opened doors to me to places that I didn't know that I should go or could go. And then the work that we've been doing over the last, I guess it's been almost 8 years now at Mason, in carceral spaces in prison, with the Department of that we have a close relationship with. I felt like they're behind a wall, not just the staff, but the residents. They're behind a wall and people aren't hearing them. And sometimes they don't even really know how to voice what it is that's wrong or what's happening to them. And I don't want to make the mistake or the sort of pompous move and say that I become their voice, but I guess I want to say that I allow them to speak to me, or I want them to speak to me. I offer them an opportunity to speak to me. And I hope that they trust me enough to know that I won't misuse it. I'll take it and I'll listen to them. And the listening is sometimes enough for them, but it isn't enough for me because I know what's happening back there, both for the staff and the residents. And I wanted other people to know in a way that I didn't see published in other books. When it comes time to press my book, you know me, so this isn't a surprise to you, but this is not a comfortable space for me, right? Publicizing my work is not something that makes me feel like, oh, yay, let's just go out and sell some books, right? So I laid in bed at night thinking about like, how can I do this in a way that stays true to my values? What matters most to me is not selling the book, it's getting their voices heard. And what matters most to me is connecting it in some way to the bigger cycle, the cycle of sort of human life that goes through entry and reentry and reintegration and trauma and harm and hurt and everything that these folks go through. How could I do that in a way that I could sleep at night, right? That I can look at my grandmother used to always say, don't do anything that makes it hard for you to look in the mirror. And I hear her voice is in my head every day, right? And I don't want to look in the mirror and think, oh, I sold a bunch of books. I want to look in the mirror and say, I connected my work to the greater work that we all do, that you do, that your organization does, that I feel like I've been doing with you for a long time, so that people hear about what happens in the carceral spaces. And then it's less surprising why they have trouble when they leave those spaces, right? If you know what's going on inside restricted housing units, and you know that 20 to 40% of all people in custody will spend time in a restricted housing unit or a solitary confinement unit, it shouldn't be at all surprising to you when they come out and have difficulty adjusting, when they feel trauma, when they've experienced things like PTSD, or when they just can't seem to get it together, or where they feel overwhelmed, or where they cry, or they have depression, or they can't seem to figure out how to get up in the morning. And that's what O.A.R does. O.A.R works with people when they have had justice involvement, not just people who have been in custody, but also people who are on probation or parole. And those people, to me, are seen but not seen, because what's hidden behind their day-to-day, their reentry struggles, is the stuff that they went through before. And O.A.R often has to work through that stuff in order to find ways to help them help themselves, or help find them the help that they might need, or the assistance, or the hand, or whatever it is that they need. And I felt like shining the light on solitary confinement was just one piece of a really big and complex puzzle, and one that I felt like I was learning something about. And it was a good way to connect the two organizations, and made the book selling less painful for me, and the message sort of leading the day, right? The message that these are human beings and we need to think about them always first.
Well, if there's nothing, in my humble opinion, that's more consistent with you, is the fact of putting the people first and thinking about them. And I would have saw it no other way. And reading the book, it was very clear that you took a lot of steps to make sure that confidentiality and other things were there to protect individuals, even in the environment that they were in. So thank you for doing that. And I think it was very consistent with who you are and what you're doing. And O.A.R appreciates you and what you're doing.
Thank you.
So in the book, you describe the balance between security and risk that both residents and employees have to face. Talk to me about, what did you consider to be the biggest risk in a restrictive housing unit, and what can it be revised with to ensure the best protection for both staff and the residents?
Thought about this question. I don't know the answer. I think I do, but I don't. This is such a complex problem. It's hard to give just a straight answer. I have a feeling people in the Q&A will be like, is she crazy? That's not it, right? I don't think there's a best answer. I think there's many. I think for me, the biggest risk is the risk of dehumanization. It's the way that the staff and the residents are so incredibly harmed in ways that they don't even recognize, or that they can't verbalize. Some of it is obvious, right? So, my hands hurt because you put the cuffs on too tight, a physical pain, right? Or a staff member gets some bodily fluid thrown at them when they're walking around, doing their rounds one evening, and the harm of having that maybe get in their mouth or touch their face, right? That's harm that you can feel. But then there's the harm of working in a space without any natural light, with rules that people don't understand, with rules that change from person to person and shift to shift, with residents that change pretty frequently, right? They're in and out of restricted housing. Some of them stay for a long period of time. Some of them are in and out. And I think about the harm that sort of both the manifest and the latent harm, right? The harm that you can see, and then the harm that you can't see. And so we try to get them, the staff and the residents, to talk to us about their experiences. And we don't ask them questions like that, like, hey, what harms you? That's not how we go about it. We just ask them to tell us stories about their lives, about what they've experienced, about their day-to-day goings on inside this space, or how it compares to other facilities, or other RHUs, or how it compares to general population. And it's always present. You can hear it. You can hear it in words that they don't even have to put together, right? They're describing to you a scenario where they don't have to say the words, I was harmed, or this hurt me, or I felt this for a long time, but you can hear it in the way that their voice changes, in the way that their eyes look down, in the way that their shoulders hunch over, or the way that they sort of shuffle in their seat. You can see it, you can hear it. And that's the part for me, that's the biggest risk in there, is that it is going, I don't want to say it's going unnoticed, because we noticed, I'm sure other people noticed, but it's going like unaccounted for, right? It just, no one is, or maybe not no one. It seems to me like there are very few people that are really paying attention to both the staff and the residents in that space, and that the harm is not only doled out to residents, that the staff are also feeling and experiencing harm in ways that are perpetuating more harm to them. And it's trickling out of the institution and into their families and into their communities, the same way that harm follows the residents when they've been released. And so I think your question also had to do with security and the balance. And I don't have a good answer. I've been studying this for a long time, and I understand the harm, or I'm beginning to understand the harm. I would say this is a lifelong quest for me. So maybe I'll write a, second or fifth or 90th book, and you can interview me 20 years or 30 years from now and I'll have better answers. I don't know. But I think the security issue is really challenging, and I'm not sure I'm going to make many friends when I say this, but it feels like we can't get out of our box. And I don't mean that in a symbolic, prison box way. It feels to me like we have very difficult time reimagining what that space could look like if we have to have the space. And there are some that believe we don't even need the carceral space. But if we are going to have the space, how could we redesign it, or what could we do that would allow for the security concerns to keep people physically safe from one another, and to keep staff safe from residents, that wouldn't also be adding the extra burden of harm to both the staff and the residents at the same time. And I begin to explore that in the last sort of substantive chapter of the book. But I'm not going to say by any stretch that I'm like a correctional expert, or that correctional expert in the sense that I've never worked in a prison myself. And I've never been incarcerated, so I've never seen it from either side. I've only seen it from the eyes of a researcher. I feel like I have some good insights, and they're developing, but I'm not sure that I'm to the point where I can make we got to do this. I don't feel like I'm there yet.
Well, thank you.
And I might not ever be, actually. I may never be. I don't know.
Well, I wish that people can see me. I feel like I'm at the church with my father, and I'm constantly nodding my head and I'm waving my arm, because I'm in total agreement with the things that you're saying, and love what you're saying. But I guess so. Is there a possibility or thought maybe RHU should only be for residents who have done something violent?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of RHUs,
Okay.
right? So no, so I'm going to say no. There's a security concern, right? There is a security concern when someone, when someone harms someone else physically, or is threatening someone else physically, because of a mental health diagnosis, or because of whatever reason, right? Whatever reason they have for harming someone, there's a security challenge with making sure that you can keep the other people who are around them safe, and keep that individual safe from possibly themselves, right? So I guess I'm not comfortable saying that we should never put people in secured spaces, right, for their own safety or for the safety of others. But I don't think that the RHU gets that job done in a way that makes a lot of sense. And so this is a silly example, but this is the one that I always come back to, right? My youngest son is 9, and he is sometimes a real jerk, right? He tries to be lovely, and most of the time he is, and occasionally he just acts like a jerk. And so if he's doing something crazy that could harm himself or could harm anyone else in the house, dogs, other kids, my mom, whatever, sometimes he has to go to his room. Like, he just needs to go and take a break, right? Go to a different space. There's never a moment when I physically remove him, right? I don't pick him up and drag him up the stair, right? I'm just like, dude, you need to find a quiet space to chill out. And I take him up to that space, but I don't leave him there for 30 days, right? I don't even leave him there for a few hours. He's 9, right? His little brain can't, he's like, oh my God, I'm in big trouble, right? I don't know what the right amount of time is, but I go up to his room in a little while and I talk to him about what happened. And sometimes he's not ready yet. sometimes he's still yelling, or he's still mad, or he's still throwing things around, right? Or whatever he's doing, he's just beating up his pillow or whatever. And I'm like, when you're ready, I'll be back. And so I leave and I go back up again. Anyone who's a parent probably has experienced something similar to this, right? Where they can't control their emotions. And I don't mean to equate my 9-year-old with any of the folks, or even one of the folks who are in custody as an adult. I'm just making a point about how important it is to hear them, how important it is for them to have a safe space to go where they feel like anger is okay. He can't control his emotions sometimes, and sure, he's learning, but he's 9. I'm hoping when I grow him into a man that he becomes a man who can control his anger. That'll be wonderful, right? I want to raise good, strong men who take care of himself and other people. But I think about the people in custody all the time about how when they put them in restricted housing units, they don't put them in there with any kind of care. It's just a removal. It's an incapacitation. You're not doing well here. Your anger is a problem. So we're going to put you over here until you figure it out. If I did that to my child or my adult son, my 21-year-old son or my 18-year-old son, chances are they're not going to figure that out, right? Maybe they calm down. Maybe they can rejoin the family unit for a while, right? But it's going to creep up again because nobody helped them figure that out. It doesn't just automatically occur. And we've given them in solitary confinement, we've given them no resources. So at least my kids could maybe listen to music to get their mentals, to get it together. They could Google, why am I so angry, right? And then they could figure that out. They could call a friend. They could do any number of things to help them figure out what their stress or anger is about. And in restricted housing, all of that is taken from them. When they commit a violent interaction, they're placed in disciplinary segregation or something akin to that, depending on which system you're in. And they don't get phone calls and they don't get books. They get, well, in the state that we go to, they get one a month, but I'm pretty sure they're not getting access to Google, right? Or the best WebMD resources, right? That's not what they're getting. They're getting like a fiction book from 1952. And so I think about that sort of scenario and how it plays out for kids and how it plays out for adults. And then when they leave that space, we expect them to have sort of had this moment where they're like, ooh, I worked out all my problems. I'm good. It doesn't work like that. And it doesn't work like that for you and me either, right? When I need help, I call a friend or I go to a therapist or I, listen to music or go for a drive. And it takes a long time to work through that stuff. And I depend on other people. But in restricted housing, we've eliminated their access to pretty much anyone. The psychological staff goes by about once a day. I went on rounds with a few of them. Those visits are 30 seconds. A minute, maybe tops at each door. And that's if she or he has time to get to every door. They're very understaffed. And I don't mean to say that I'm blaming it on the staff. I just think the entire structural system is set up to lock them away and then just unlock the door. And we've decided that that's what they need. And I don't think in anyone's mind that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, clearly it shouldn't if it does. But one of the things that you mentioned was the staff. And as reading the book, one of the things that I noticed, it seems like there's a transition for a lot of military individuals to work in a place of helping people with incarceration and match up from their skills and other things that they're doing. But then there's this thing of PTSD and other experiences that individuals have in the military. So do you think that the environment could be triggering anything from a PTSD perspective? And is that the best background and qualifications to get people to be in such an environment, in your opinion?
I know it's a rough system. I'm not a clinician, so I can't say for sure if they have PTSD or if that space is a trigger for them in any way. But I would definitely say that their mental health is definitely affected because it seems like all the staff members have mental health problems of some sort, right? They don't all say, oh, I'm a diagnosed schizophrenic, right? I don't mean it in that way. I just mean that they struggle with the day-to-day. They struggle with how to remedy the sort of things that they see and do in that space, and then to go home to their families and children. The scientific literature tells us that correctional staff have a tremendous amount of challenges, right? High levels of alcohol misuse, high levels of substance use, high levels of divorce, high levels of aggression, high levels of domestic violence, interpersonal violence. It shouldn't be surprising that you see folks who are working in an environment where they feel at risk pretty much every day, all day, having some sort of after effect from that that is affecting their friendships or their families or their wives and husbands or their children or their communities. The military service is a tough one because I fully understand why institutions do that, right? It's very difficult. Most of these institutions, at least in the state that we were in, are in rural parts of the state. And that's true for lots of states around the US. And so the people that end up working in those institutions largely come from that space, right? They grew up there. Becoming a correctional officer in many states does not require any form of higher education. So you just get a high school. You could have some college, and many of the folks that we met did, but you don't have to. You come in with a high school diploma, and the military service is a sort of like almost like a lateral move over, because in order to hire someone in an institutional system, and not all states work the same way, but in this system, you could take the better part of 6 months to a year to get a new employee hired, because you've got to do the civil service exam, then you've got to go through the hiring process, which takes a while anyway. Then you've got to put them through the academy training. Then they've got to then they've got to get assigned to an institution, and then they've got to sort of apprentice or shadow for a year until they're fully functioning as a correctional officer. And the military service gets by that whole first couple of phases, right? Because there's no background check required for folks with military service because they've already been backgrounded. And if they've been in any kind of, they don't have to be, but if they've been in any sort of law enforcement in the military, that's even better because they've gotten a lot of the tactical training or other training that they would need in the institution. So those, and in some states, they even get extra points, or sort of like, I'm going to call them bonus points, but someone who knows more about this would be like, it's not bonus points. I'm not sure what it's called, but they get like extra credit almost for having certain types of service or certain types of experiences in their background. And so when they come in, they don't have to come in take the civil service exam and then go through the full process. They get to come in here, and it just cuts months off of that recruitment time. And I mean, you can imagine as a lieutenant or a deputy at an institution that is down on staff, you're working these guys double shifts and you're mandating it, right? So Derwin shows up for his shift and you're like automatic overtime, right? And you're like, oh, great, I'm going to miss my family again, right? Here I am, 16 hours. And I'm doing that to you for the better part of a year, right? Because you're making a boatload of money, but your wife is not ever seeing you, and your children forgot they even had a dad at this point, right? It's a disaster, and you're tired and you're like burnout. And so if I can get military guys to come in, guys with who are vets, to come in at a different level and speed that hiring process up, I fully get why they do it. I'm just not certain, and I'm not certain. I don't, no disrespect to military personnel. I think they're wonderful. I'm just wondering if the system doesn't set itself up for efficiency over effectiveness. Are we really looking for the people that would best fit in those roles, or are we just looking for any people who will fit in those roles? Because that's who lives in those rural communities, because that's who's willing to work at an institution, because that's who can skip ahead of the line. Like, those systems make full and perfect sense to me, but I don't think that they best serve the institutional goals if the goals are in any way, shape, or form targeted toward rehabilitation.
Right.
We've taken people that don't have a background in that, and we've put them in a space to do something else. And that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I kind of look at that a little bit as pulling yourself up by your bootstraps type of mentality, and looking at individuals doesn't equate anything to rehabilitation as far as that is concerned. So I guess when I think about the book and I read the story, I thought it was very interesting that you told the story from two sides. You gave both entity, well, there was three sides actually. There's administrators as well as the deputy, as well as the individuals that were incarcerated. And I had another one. You talked a little bit about the family impact and reentry. So there's multiple sides as far as that is concerned. But you do tell the story from both sides, staff and residents. Talk to me a little bit about what did you learn from talking to both of them about how they experience harm and develop coping mechanisms to deal with being in that environment you were just talking about.
Yep, I think that's one of the big, for me, that's one of the bigger contributions of the book, is the story from both sides of the bars, right? The idea that there are a lot of books on the market that talk about residents' experiences in restricted housing. So there's a lot of journalists who have gone in and talked to people, sometimes in the space, usually post the space. You know, somebody's spent, 20 or 30 years in restricted housing, they'll finally get released and then they'll sell their story, or the journalist will help them write their story. There's a lot of psychological studies of mostly survey indices where people will go in and ask, a series battery of questions to find out about what types of harm people are experiencing in the RHU. So those stories I feel like have been told. On the staff side, mostly the research on correctional staff is about burnout and stress. That's kind of what we do. And again, it's a series of survey and instruments that look at sort of indices, indice level questions, right? So on a scale of 1 to 5, from best to worst, how do you feel about X? How do you feel about Y? How does this impact, right? Those sort of things. And I think those are great, but that's not the kind of research I do. And I grew up in a small town in rural upstate New York. And a good chunk, almost all of my friends, mostly male friends, but there are a few females also, didn't leave my small town. They stayed in that area. Some of them went to college, but many of them did not. And many of them ended up working in prisons. During the time that I was growing up, New York City filled up its prisons and didn't have anywhere to put its many folk that it was arresting. And it started buying up cheap farmland in upstate New York and putting maximum and medium security prisons all over where there used to be plants and farms. There are now maximum and medium security prisons all over upstate where I grew up. And so those people that I grew up with became correctional officers. And I literally watched them. I knew them. I'm going to say small town, but I mean small town, right? It took 5 small towns to make up one high school where I went to school. That's how small a town it is. My high school graduating class was 142. It's just itty bitty, right? And most of us knew each other from kindergarten. People didn't leave there. It's not a transient place, right? If I were to go there today and I were to walk into the local grocery store, there's a real good chance that I would see at least a couple people that know me, know my dad, know my grandparents. They knew where I lived. There's a road named after my family up there, right? It's craziness. And so I watched these people that I had known from the time we were in kindergarten become something else. They didn't talk the same. They didn't act the same. They didn't look the same. They were, I'm going to say I'm going to say sadder, but I don't know if that fits all of them, but they didn't like their jobs very much, but it was a really good job for someone without a college degree. It pays very well. It's unionized. They knew they were going to get 20 years and a big fat pension. That's a great opportunity for someone who lives in a small town like that, who doesn't have an opportunity to make the kind of money that you make in a bigger city, or the kind of money that you make if you start your own business maybe, or right. It just wasn't an option for them. And so many of them went there, and for a long time, I felt like I didn't know them. I felt like I don't even know you. We'd go out to a local bar, have a couple drinks, and I'd be thinking you, sir, are not the same person, right? Something's off about you. And I don't know that I was angry with them, but I just thought what's happening? So when it came time for us to do work inside custodial facilities, there was no other possible choice. I can't just tell the story from the residents, because the residents are only half of the story. And the residents are directly and indirectly and continually impacted by and impacting the staff. It is a delicate dance that happens in those spaces between the staff and the residents. And I don't think as a researcher or as a human, I can do that story justice unless I at least try to tell it as complex as it is. It's the reason why tonight, I think I'm worried now. I'm worried that my answers are going to be completely unsatisfying for people, because I have no good, here's what you do. Because the story is 4,000 layers thick, right? All the stuff that comes with the staff and all the stuff that comes with the residents and all the stuff that comes with the system are all intermingled. And you can't just look at it and say, ooh, I got the answer. We're just going to do this. Because there's a ripple effect. For every this that you decide to do, it's affecting these other pieces. And so for me, the story has to be told, even if it's unsatisfying, it has to be told in a holistic way so that you can see the complexity of the problem. And then maybe you begin to chip away at little pieces of that complex problem that you think you can make a difference in. I'm not going to say solving, but in beginning to remedy. And you can't possibly make a change for the residents without considering the staff, or vice versa, because they're just, that's the only other humans that they're seeing is each other. No, I think you're muted, Derwin.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I just noticed that we've received a couple of questions. I wanted to go off script a little bit and see what we have here. Consider you mentioned that you have not worked in or lived in a carceral space, and this is an ethnographic study. What ethical considerations do you consider when designing this research when it comes to analyzing the data so as to reduce bias and uncertainty while centering these voices in the findings?
That's a good question. I think we use a large research team, and we try to get as diverse a research team as is possible. And by diverse, I don't just mean race and ethnicity. I also mean every possible way that you can think about diversity. Age, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, race and ethnicity, of course, educational skill level, all kinds of stuff, which I think helps with the team, but it's not perfect. Right, the team that I put together for these years in prison were largely, not all, but largely white women. That's who was in graduate school, and those are the undergrads that we got to apply to our job ad, looking for undergrads to come do research with us. So we are somewhat diverse. They're not all white women, but they were largely white women. And so I'm not going to say we as a team do, one, we try to make sure that we don't have a series of set questions when we go into the space, because we want the space to tell us its own story. And so we have a set of focal areas, things that we're interested in. And sometimes, depending on what part of the study we're in, we maybe narrow those a little bit. If we go in, for example, for this project, the first year or year and a half, we went in with really big, broad themes, like, tell me about risk, tell me about relationships, tell me about punishment, right? Just general stuff. And we just probe around those questions to see what came out. When stuff starts to arise up, then we go back and sort of poke a little bit harder at something that something that a few people said, right? So, a bunch of people told us about, whatever it is, the food. And then we'd go back and ask some really specific questions about the food, but we'd also just add some contextual questions. These conversations, for me, and I don't know if this is true for researchers everywhere, but for me, when you open the door to a conversation and you let the person you're interviewing, I'm going to use that word loosely because it's really conversationing, right? When you're talking to someone and you let them go wherever they want to go, then the story becomes their story. It isn't my story. So we don't have a clipboard in front of us with question 1, question 2. In fact, all we do is memorize this sort of list of broad themes that we're interested in. And we don't even do them in the same order, right? If I'm talking to you and the first thing you say to me is, a guard beat me yesterday. Well, okay, I'm gonna follow up with that, right? That's where you want to be. If what you really want to talk about is your daughter and the fact that you just missed her 50th ballet performance and you can't get to see her, then that's what you and I are going to spend our time talking about. And I'll weave in some other themes if I can in that conversation, but I'm not going to force you to answer every question on my list or every theme in my head. If you want to talk about something else, I'm going to maneuver that conversation in your way. You're maneuvering it. I'm just along for the ride. So that's one thing that we do to make sure that they have the voice, that we don't give them the answers or give them like, hey, we're going to talk about X. Instead, it's more like, I have a bunch of questions for you. One of them is about this. Do you have anything to say about that? And they just run wherever they're going to run. The team, when we do analysis, we do all kinds of interesting things for analysis. So we have a variety of different people who will code, and we break those groups up, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 different people coding the same data set. We code in different ways. Sometimes one person codes for a set number of codes and the other person lets codes emerge. Sometimes everybody codes for the same thing and they test their inter-rater reliability so that they're sure that they're coding in the right way. Everybody's coding the same thing. If they saw the same thing, it'd be the same. Sometimes a whole team will code it. Sometimes it gets over-coded by one of my more advanced now, she's not a grad student anymore. She's a PhD now, Dr. Magnuson. She'll over-code it again, look at it again. We do all kinds of querying of the data to see if it holds up. So they say, hey, we got this storyline in our data that says, whatever, residents really wish that they could, use tablets when they're in the RHU so they could communicate with and I'll be like, really, that's really interesting. What do you mean residents? And they'll be like, we know the residents. What do you mean? What do you mean residents? And I'm like, well, which ones? Like, well, all of them. And I'm like, that's just totally not true, right? Go back in there and find out who said that. And so then what I call cutting the data, right? We cut it by race or ethnicity. We cut it by how long someone's been in there. We cut it by time, right? Do they really want the tablet in their first 5 days, in their second 5 days, or in their last 30 days? Like, we cut it by everything to see what the patterns are in the data. If it turns out that 100% everybody wants them, and everybody wants them the whole time, and they don't care if they're black, white, if they're old, young, whatever, that's a really interesting story, but that's very rare. There's usually some sort of pattern to the data, right? People who've been in there longer could care less, people who want, whatever it is. And so we look for that story. And that the idea is to make sure that we don't get clouded by the louder voices, that we don't get clouded by the sexier stories, right? That all the data has an equal footing and an equal play in the storyline. But when more people talk about something, we have to follow that through to I'm going to say conclusion, but it's never actually done. Follow it all the way through to see how that story plays out among various people or among various spaces. Is it the same in A unit as it is in B unit? Is it the same on the 2 to 10 shift as it is on the 6 to 10 shift? Right? What does that mean? And so there's 100,000 ways. I feel like I'm teaching a qualitative methods class, but there's a million ways, but those are some of the ways that we make sure, or we try to make sure, I'm sure we don't always get it right, that we have a large team. We use a team science approach, that everybody plays in the sandbox at the same time. We balance ideas. We allow for negative case analysis. So if something's really weird, one person said something that no one else said, we try to figure out what's going on with that case and try to see how it helps or hurts what we're talking about. I don't shy away from things that I don't understand. We just keep digging further and further into a hole. Sometimes it feels like a rabbit hole, but sometimes it just takes a while to get down to the space where you're like, all right, now I can see it. It's one of the great benefits of research that I think I love about research, is that when you're doing it, if you're a resident in that space, you might not see the full pattern because you're only talking to the guy on your right and the guy on your left. But if I can show you data from 351 residents in 7 different prisons, that same person could do the same analysis that I'm doing. They just can't do it from their 6 by 9 foot cell when they only have 4 other voices that they can hear.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the question that was presented to us. Was there a particular chapter in the book or particular message that you wanted readers and listeners tonight to really focus on? Are there some details or some things that you want to make sure that people hear and understand as far as your book is concerned?
And they're all super important. And I feel like I should say relationships because I've been talking about harm for so long, but I'm going to say the rules chapter is probably the chapter that, because I'm an organizational sociologist by training. So I always tend to look at organizational systems and the way that they work. And it's always been mesmerizing to me that the prisons, and particularly RHUs, are so incredibly ineffective. They're so incredibly inefficient. In any other space, that business would have failed long ago, right? We don't have systems like, I mean, can you imagine a space like like Chick-fil-A or McDonald's, right? If they could not do a better job of running the Chick-fil-A than what a prison is doing, we would not be eating spicy chicken sandwiches anymore.
No.
Like, come on, you see the line at the drive-through, right? And you're like, oh my God, there's like 87 cars here. And I'm not advocating for or against Chick-fil-A because it's not I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat Chick-fil-A, but I'm just saying, you see it and you think, I don't want to sit in this line. And then inevitably my 9-year-old is like, I need a Chick-fil-A, right? So I'm sitting there and literally 4 minutes later, I've got a sandwich, fries, maybe mac and cheese and a shake. And I'm like, dang, like they are very efficient. They're effective and they're efficient. And some of my son's friends have worked there and they love it. they really like the environment there, right? And that's not true for all organizational workplaces, but I have yet to talk to a prison staff member who tells me that working in restricted housing is literally their life's dream, that they just absolutely love every moment of every day in that space. Now, where some days may be better than others, and they may really enjoy working in a carceral space for other reasons. They like the camaraderie, they like other things about the space, they like the pension, the idea of having a pension, the great benefits that they get. I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and I've never, ever, ever talked to a correctional officer. There have been a couple of program staff that really felt very fulfilled in their work, but a security level staff, right? A custodial level staff member, I've never heard one say those kind of things. And I also watch them do things incredibly inefficiently, and they know it. It isn't as if they're not like, this is a finely tuned machine, right? They're like, I have no idea why we do this. And I don't even know where this form goes when I submit it. And I'll say, why did you give that guy an envelope and not that guy? And they're like, because I don't know, he's cool. Like there's no thing that you can put your hand on that says, here's what's wrong with this system, right? It's literally that no one in the space knows all of the rules. No one in the space is moving in a way that creates a level of efficiency that a for-profit business would have to have in order to stay in business. And no one is happy. So I can't think of another organization. Maybe people on the call are like, DMV, man, DMV, right? But I'm like, maybe. But the last time I went to the DMV, actually, she was lovely. So I'm thinking maybe they're moving in the right direction over at the DMV. But it's horrible, right? They don't know the rules. They have to use such amazing discretion to operate within which they think is the law, right? They don't want to go so far outside that they're like going to be in deep trouble, right? And the prison's going to get some sort of investigation. But they operate in this limbo land between rules, which you would imagine would be very strict in a space like an RHU, right? You would imagine that there would be like, these are how we do our business. And in fact, it is anyone's guess on any given day what will happen in that space, both because of the residents and their actions and reactions, and the staff, their actions and reactions. And so I think the rules chapter for me was the one that I was most inspired about, because because it asked more questions than it answered, right? I'm going right back in. And the next thing I'm going to do as soon as I get access to another RHU unit is try to figure out more about the rules, because what I give you in the book is really just the beginning of something much, much deeper and much more interesting on a systems and organizational level that I haven't been able to. I do a good job in the chapter. I'm not dogging myself out, but there's so much more there that I need to spend more time there looking at that. So I think the fact that we have a business that is in the business to have humans contain and control other humans, and when you ask both of those sets of humans the rules or policies or procedures of living in that space, they don't know what they are. And to me, that means that there is a significant problem with that system, and we need to do a lot more work to figure out how to make it better.
So when we talk about figuring out how to make something better, one of the things that come to my mind in our relationship is best practices. I'm always trying to get you to help me to find best practices for reentry, best practices for employment services, best practices for this. And you'll often hit me with the words that, well, Derwin, there's some things here. I can't tell you how promising it is. I can't tell you how good it is, but it's here. I don't know if I would use it. So let's talk about best practices from the perspective of RHUs. There's a lot of people investing in trying to do best practices. Have you come across any research that described reentry best practices for RHU residents?
No.
No.
I want to say yes, but I'm going to say no. I think what I tell my students, they're very, not all of them, many of them are very idealistic, right? They want to change the world, and I love everything about them for wanting that. And I don't not want to change the world, but I want to change it one morsel at a time, right? So what is it that I can do in the next 6 months or the next 6 weeks or the next 6 years that it's going to make a difference. And so I think about reform practices at that level instead of like let's ban all RHUs. I'm not saying I'm not a fan. I'm just not sure we can jump from where we are to not having any. So in the meantime, I'd like to make them more humane, maybe, if I dare say, kinder. I don't know if I could say that about RHUs, but I want that. And so I think about that. So one of the recommendations I make in the book, which might look like low-hanging fruit to some people, is just to feed them. I think food is an important part of someone's mental health. I think it's an important part of their ability to function. And we've watched over many years in the RHUs, people not being fed in ways that I think are providing the sustenance that they need. There are rules. There are rules about how often they have to get fed. There are rules in some states and jurisdictions about how many calories, what is the caloric intake that someone has to have in a 24-hour period. And the state that we were in has rules about when to feed them, but they can also not feed them, right? You could have thrown, let's say, feces at me yesterday. And when I come to your door, I don't open your wicket, the little hole in the door, right? And you're banging on the door and you're saying, I didn't get fed. And I'm like, well, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. I gave you a tray. I can get away with that for a few days. I can't get away with it forever. I can't starve you. I mean, maybe in some jurisdictions, maybe, but unlikely in the ones we were in. I'm not going to starve you to death, but I can make it pretty hard for you. I can also give you a tray that doesn't have all the items on it. I can make sure that your tray comes cold. I can serve you last. I can go by everybody's door, knock on everyone's door and give them their tray. But to you, I just say, dinner. And I hope that you hear me. And when you didn't, I'll be like, well, dude, you should have come to the door. Right? I can find ways to not feed you. And I don't blame them for not feeding you, because I don't really want you to throw feces at me either. But I think there's got to be options for us to make sure that they get food at every meal. And there also has to be options. And anyone who studies prisons on this call knows that their food offerings are just abysmal. And schools, not all schools food is pretty bad too, but there have been jurisdictions around the US who have done a much better job with their food service, right? Thinking about how to get healthier options, how to get macronutrients into food for children. During the Obama years, and even before that, taking out soda machines and putting in healthier options for children to be able to buy in their high schools. Coming up with, I mean, I can go to Whole Foods now and buy a sort of macro, vegan, all natural, whatever bar. There's got to be a way to make those cost effective. And in the book, I talk about the cost to nutrient ratio of food, what you're actually getting from the amount of money that you spend, and having somebody who's got that kind of experience, maybe in economics, taking a look at their food budgets and saying, like, look, you could actually feed them less if you fed them better. Right? You don't have to give them 2 pieces of bread. You could just give them each 1 piece of bread if you bought them bread that actually had some grain in it, right? Like, let's just try to rethink this. But I think we've been stuck in a weird spot for so long, and we tend to look toward big reforms, right? Like places like Colorado and New Jersey and New York, all saying that they've eliminated or significantly reduced or changed their use of restricted housing. And I don't not appreciate that. But I also think on the day-to-day levels, there's some real basic stuff that people need. Like, they need the ability to eat. And so I think there's levels of reforms that need to be dealt with. And at the moment, I don't know if I'll feel this way next week, but at the moment, I feel more comfortable dealing with the lower needs, the sort of more visceral needs, than I do with the removal of a system.
Thank you for that. Another question from the audience. To what extent do you think independent oversight of jails/prisons would help make carceral spaces become more humane?
I want to say that would help, but I also am I'm an organizational sociologist, and so it doesn't usually work out that well, to be honest with you. There's all kinds of politics and power that come into play in those spaces, and some of it is based on stuff that we know, prejudice, bias, discrimination, right? Some of it is just based on resources, funding, whatever it is. Like the power comes in all different phases. And so I would like to say optimistically that would have some, that it could improve things. And I think it could. But it tends to be that when you have an oversight agency, you also need oversight of the oversight, because the oversight agency usually has some sort of dog in the fight on the side of the thing that they're overseeing, or on the side of the people who want it overseen. And when that's the case, the power and the politics dynamic just gets in the way of true oversight. It becomes a sort of power or political battle. And I don't think that it serves the people who need to be seen.
Thank you for that. One of the things that was very intriguing to me, and just thinking about this question, I was thinking about end dates. If people who went into restrictive housing units had a light at the tunnel for reentry back into general populations, and they knew they had an end date, would that be helpful to people to use their time successful, or not to lose hope? How do you think that may invigorate, motivate, help, or not help individuals that are in restrictive housing units?
Many of them do have an end date. They were given a sentence to go to the RHU for, let's say, 30 days. But what happens once they're down there isn't always a 30-day sentence, right? So they can get more time when they're down there. They get 30, 60, 90. It could be any. I'm just using 30 as an example. They could be any number, 180 days. But they do have a sort of end date that's given to them at sentencing. But that sentence can last for many years and even decades, depending on their behavior when they're down there. It's also institutional protocols. So if Derwin is coming into the RHU today and he's got a 30-day sentence, at the end of 30 days, I got to have a place to put him. And so I got to look at the general population units and determine where Derwin can go. Derwin can't go to B block because that's where his co-defendant is. Derwin can't go to C block because there's a guy from a rival gang in Unit C, right? So I can't put him there. So he's got to go back to A, but there's no open beds in A. So Derwin's been in for 30 days, but he's going to have to stay a few more days until I open up a space in A, right? And so I can keep with this example, but I think you see where I'm going, right? There's lots of problems, right? And Derwin might have also put in a request to transfer because Derwin's family is from city, I don't know, New York City, and my prison is in the western part of New York, and he's trying to get closer to home. And so now I'm like, okay, great. Now I got to get a transfer set up for him, and I got to move him. And then the other prison is like, we don't have room for people like Derwin. We're not taking him. And then you got like, right, there's a lot of shifting that has to happen in that space. And so what happens is sometimes people get lost. It's true. I don't find that as much in the system that we were in, but I think I've heard stories of people having that happen to them in other systems where they've just sort of gotten forgotten once they've been placed in restrictive housing. But there's all kinds of things that can happen to you when you're down there, and solitary confinement in the state that we were in, and in many states, is not solitary. You often have cellmates. And so even if you're behaving yourself and doing the right thing, your cellie can clog the toilet and you both get another 30 days. Your cellie can beat you up and you have to defend yourself and you both get another 60 days. Like, some of it is out of your control. I mean, you can do anything you want to, but you're in a 6 by 9 foot space. If he's coming after you, he's gonna get you. It's not like there's anywhere to go. And then there's no, it's your word against his and you both get whatever. Like, I can think of a million reasons why that 30-day end date doesn't mean 30 days. And it also doesn't mean that you're not coming right back. I can put you right back in general population and you could forget, you could be sleeping when I do count and you can go right back down there the next day.
Yeah, it sounds like a very complex place where it's not just as simple as 1, 2, 3, and 4. And there's multiple things that could impact you. And there's things that can impact you that aren't even your own fault or responsibilities, which I'm sure can be very frustrating for individuals.
Agree. Well, and for the staff too, right? So much is out of their control that what they can control is often not enough.
Okay. Down to the last couple of questions that we have here and everything. You discussed the carceral system in Norway, and there's been implementation of several models in the United States, and these models have shown some success in reducing recidivism. help really to understand the concept of rehabilitation and restorative justice, which I'm very fond of, has been slow to take hold here in the United States because there's multiple ways of doing restorative justice. And it seems like there's only one way that people want to focus on, and it's putting the victim with the person who committed the crime and going forward from there. But we know that there's plenty of other ways to be able to do it. Do you think the first step the United States will have to take includes a widespread cultural shift in a large social context away from the concept of what you do for me, I'll do to them, or an eye for an eye punishment, and instead looking towards rehabilitation practices? But talk to me a little bit about that, if I fleshed it out well enough for you.
I do. I think the simple answer for me is that we tend to punish because, I'm going to say we as a whole, even though this might not be true for many people on this call, we as a society, in my view, punish because it meets our moral obligation as opposed to meeting any others. So we don't really punish for any other reason except to make ourselves feel like we did something.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you don't connect yourself to the punishment, you disconnect yourself from the punishment, right? So like the example I gave earlier, my son, Jace, you go to your room and then I just leave him there. And then in 30 days, I just open the door and tell him to come out. Maybe it helped me. I did incapacitate him, right? I stuck him in his room for 30 days. I don't know if I got an eye for an eye, really. Like, you hurt me, I hurt you. Maybe I did, but not a literal one, right? You broke the lamp, so I'm going to break your lamp. Like, that's probably not where I'm headed. And I definitely, I believe maybe that I get a deterrent value. Well, I'll just lock him in there long enough so he won't want to do it again. I definitely didn't get any kind of rehabilitation value out of sending him up there. So I do think a cultural shift is necessary, but I think I'm going to say this out loud and people are going to beat me up. I know who the participants on this call are. I think for me, the cultural shift is not a shift back toward rehabilitation. It's a shift towards separating morality and punishment. That if you have to take the morality out of the punishment, at least maybe not fully, I'm not sure if you can fully do that, but you have to separate what you believe is morally right and wrong and assign the punishment as a way of, I'm going to say correcting, and I do mean rehabilitative, but not only, right? That it's a pathway out of the thing that you're doing and towards something else. And instead, right now, we have a pathway that leads to a wall. It doesn't go anywhere else, right? You just go in. When you're in there, nothing happens and you don't do anything, and no one treats you any better or worse than what, maybe worse, maybe not, than what you were treated on the outside. And it's because it makes us feel better as opposed to it actually helps us. Because I don't actually think we're helped at all by doing this either. If we knew that, I mean, this is back to your other question about evidence-based stuff, right? If you know that doing that harm to other people is actually harming you too, why is that the choice we continue to make if it isn't that we are blocked by our own morality? I'm willing to be harmed because it fits with what I believe.
Thank you for that. And I'm not going to get on my soapbox right now, so I'm going to move to the next question.
I don't want to be on one either.
Because I know that they do a lot of things and you weren't. You made some great points that I'm sure other people would like to chime in and talk about as far as that is concerned. So my coup de grace for the night, or my last question for you, is about this book section. There was a lot of information in that section that really helped me to put a lot of things together as far as you're concerned, the people that helped you, the way that you treated people, and so on. What did you hope to accomplish with this section of the book, and how should it help readers know all of that backstory?
I think there's a lot to say. I'll try to be brief because I think we're getting over. I think one, I'm an educator. I'm an educator, right? I literally love what I do. I'm positive that I was born to be a research professor, to mix together the teaching and mentoring of people with the learning from people. It's who I'm supposed to be. I'm sure of it. I tell my students all the time, I wake up happy and I go to bed happy. Like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And so for me, that section feels like the education part of the book, right? Which is where I'm helping young researchers who are starting in the field, or more seasoned researchers who've never researched inside a carceral setting, right? What does it look like? How do I do it? What are some of the crazy choices that your team had to make? How can I make those too? So that's part of the like how-to guide, right? How to do. But then my co-authors, Angie Hattery and Shannon Magnuson, were instrumental in helping me learn and grow about who I am as a person and who I am as a scholar. And it's only in the last few years that I've really begun thinking really critically about my own positionality as a white, cis woman, middle-aged, right? Living in an upper class community. I'm not upper class, but I live in an upper class community. Like, what does that mean for the research I'm doing with people who have very different life experiences than I do? And how do I tell stories or be true to the research? And I'm using true loosely, but how do I do that in a way that isn't commodification or selling them out, or like taking their stories and, like, I'm not going to say profiting because academic books don't make a bunch of money, but you know what I mean? Putting it out there. How do I do that in a way that feels right? And so Shannon and Angie, I think the first draft of that chapter I wrote, they were like, girl, get it together. Like, this is a hot mess, right? And so they kind of held my hand and walked me through the story that I needed to tell, not only about the way that my team works and the way that we do the research, but about the way that I work. How does my experience and my race or my gender or my age or my positionality as a mom, as a whatever, how does that cloud or cover or create or move the needle at all in the work that we're doing? And then how does our team function in a way that we're able to play off of each other's strengths or weaknesses or learn and grow from each other? And so I tried to put that in there so that people would, one, know me a little better, to know that you carry it with you like baggage, right? I can't not be this person. This is who I am. I came from my humble upbringings in upstate New York, and the privilege that I have for my race or sometimes my gender, right? It's just, I don't know. And so Shannon and Angie helped me a lot to be able to, I guess, be a little more vulnerable about what strengths I have and what strengths we as a team have, and where we see faults in our own methods and in our own renderings of what we've seen and done. We're definitely not perfect, and I don't want anyone to think that we are. They're just both incredible human beings, and I learned a lot, and so that was in there. And then the third part was that's usually my favorite section of books like this, right? I love it when an author who's a researcher that I respect or like pulls back the curtain a little bit and shows me some of the dirty laundry, right? Like, it wasn't always easy. And how did you get people to talk to you? And what happened when you figured out that you'd asked all the wrong questions? How'd you go back and get better answers? Like, we just screw it up. We're just not great. We're good, but we're not great. And sometimes we make mistakes. And I wanted to have some of that humility in that last chapter so that people don't feel like they're reaching an unattainable goal all the time in research. It's just baby steps. We're making baby steps and we're doing the very best that we can. And I hope that it inspires people to do more of this work because it's really important.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share this day with you. It made me very proud that you trusted me enough to do this with you today. When you speak of humility, that's one of the greatest examples that you show me in every time that I interact with you, and I so greatly appreciate you in that. I have some thank yous and acknowledgements I would like to do. To the residents and the staff who graciously spoke to you, to your research team, and allowed you into their world and trusted you with their narrative and experiences, thank you. To your co-authors that you've already mentioned, Dr. Magnuson and Dr. Hattery, thank you. To Stanford University Press, in particular, Marcel Maxfield, your editor, also Adam, Kendra, Emma, who helped sponsor, arrange, and organize this evening's event, thank you. To the O.A.R. staff and board of directors for helping to organize and host this event, thank you. And last but not least, the Center for Advancing Correctional Excellence at George Mason University, who will post a recorded version of this talk on their website, www.gmuace.org, for everyone after this event. Last thing I would like to chime in and say is that Dr. Roods will attend O.A.R's 50th anniversary event on May 19th at the Winery of Bull Run, and will have 30 free books that she will be signing for the first 30 individuals that would be in line for her at our 50th anniversary event. So if it's not about supporting O.A.R, by all means, please come out and support Dr. Roods and get a copy of this wonderful book. I thought I was at the age to quit learning, but when I read your book, I learned something more.
No way, you're never at the age to quit learning.
Well, I wanted to be anyway, so that's where I am. So I don't know if there's any other questions or any other things for us to address this evening. I looked at the chats and the questions. No, it doesn't look as if there is. Danielle, once again, thank you for trusting me and allowing me to be a part of this. I hope I did your work as much justice and respect as I wanted to do. God bless each and every individual that was part of this event tonight. And thank you so much for all your work, and your work is making the world a better place. And I appreciate you and everything you do.
As is yours, Derwin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And you guys have a blessed evening.
Thank you.